Jason's heart stopped at the edge of his pool, letting out a long, measured sigh, as if he could release the weight of the past few years with it. The crystal-clear water reflected the sky, now painted in golden hues by the setting sun, and the cool evening air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint fragrance of the flowers he had planted along the garden's edges. This wasn't just a backyard. It wasn't just a pool. It was the result of a promise he had made to himself when 3 years ago his life had fallen apart. Not a subscriber yet? Join our community by clicking subscribe and turning on the notification bell to get notified. Every time a new video is posted, the divorce had been the breaking point, a long, exhausting and lonely process that forced him to rethink many things. Jason had never been the kind of man who sought attention or constant company. On the contrary, he had always valued his space, his privacy, his ability to disconnect from the world at the end of each day. However, the solitude that followed the separation was different. It wasn't chosen, it was imposed. To avoid thinking about it, he threw himself into his work more intensely than ever. As a civil engineer specializing in urban infrastructure, his days became a succession of blueprints, endless meetings, and structural calculations. He spent more hours at the office than at home, convinced that staying busy was the only way to keep himself from sinking into his own thoughts, and the strategy worked, at least on the surface. The promotion he received at the beginning of that year felt like validation. Finally, his efforts had yielded tangible results, and with it came a decision. It was time to start over. He sold his small apartment in the city and moved to the suburbs, looking for something his previous life had never given him: peace. The process of finding the perfect house was more complicated than he had expected. He wasn't just looking for comfort or modernity. He wanted a sense of belonging, a space where he could breathe without feeling overwhelmed by the relentless noise of the city. After weeks of searching, he found the property at the end of a cul-de-sac, large garden, spacious house, and most importantly, a pristine pool. The pool was the deciding factor. From the moment he saw it, he knew it would be his sanctuary. He imagined summer nights floating in the water under the stars, afternoons of relaxation with a book in hand, and the absolute certainty that at last he had a place of his own where no one else would set the rules. But what Jason didn't know at that moment was that his long-awaited peace was about to turn into an unexpected battle. At first, the neighborhood seemed to be exactly what he had wanted. Quiet, well-kept houses, and a community that described itself as family-oriented and close-knit. During the tour with the real estate agent, he was told about the community events, the collective Christmas decorations, and the summer barbecues they hosted at the neighborhood park. Jason listened politely, but without much interest. He wasn't there to make friends. Moving day went by without major issues. As the movers unloaded boxes, some neighbors came by to introduce themselves. The Watsons, an elderly couple who lived directly across the street, greeted him with warm smiles from their porch. To his right, a young couple with a baby offered him homemade cookies as a welcome gift. Everything was cordial, at a level Jason could tolerate without feeling invaded, but the Marshalls were different. From the moment they introduced themselves, Jason felt something about them that put him on edge. Help our channel grow. Leave a bid, like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated on our latest content. And we want to know, where are you watching from? Comment below. Chuck Marshall was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a booming voice and a confident smile. His wife, Melissa, exuded a friendliness that seemed too rehearsed, the kind of person who always organized gatherings and made sure everyone participated. Behind them stood their 3 children, 2 identical teenage boys and a younger girl hiding behind her mother. "Welcome to the neighborhood, man," Chuck said, shaking Jason's hand with a grip so strong it nearly crushed his fingers. You got yourself a great place. My kids are already jealous of that pool. Jason forced a smile. He wasn't sure how to respond to that. It's a nice place, he said simply, hoping to end the conversation quickly. If you need anything, anything at all, just let us know, Melissa added enthusiastically. We live right next door and have been here for years. It's a great community. You'll see. Jason thanked them and, after a few minutes of polite conversation, managed to excuse himself. As he climbed the steps to his house, he cast one last glance at the Marshalls. Chuck was still standing on the porch, smiling in a relaxed manner, his arms crossed over his chest. It was a friendly posture, on the surface. But there was something in his expression that left Jason with an uneasy feeling. And then, without knowing why, Jason was certain that this family was going to be a problem. The first few days in his new home passed without incident. After weeks of stress from the move, he finally got to enjoy the peace he had sought for so long. The quiet nights in the backyard, with the cool breeze and the moon's reflection on the water, became his favorite part of the day. The neighborhood had its own rhythm. The Watsons hosted visitors on Sundays, and their grandchildren played on the lawn until sunset. The young couple went jogging every morning, pushing the baby's stroller, and the Marshalls, well, the Marshalls were the loudest. The laughter of the teenage boys, the sound of a basketball bouncing on the pavement, and Chuck's booming voice organizing barbecues in his backyard were impossible to ignore. At first, Jason didn't think much of it. He wasn't the kind of person to be bothered by a little noise, but the first warning sign came on a Saturday afternoon. Jason had gone out for a run, and upon returning, he noticed something unusual in his backyard. A group of teenagers was splashing in the water, laughing and playing as if it were a public pool. Jason stopped abruptly, his brow furrowing as he tried to process what he was seeing. Among the kids, he recognized the Marshall twins. They were there, in his pool, as if it was nothing. Jason took a deep breath, keeping his composure, and walked toward them. The teenagers noticed him immediately. The laughter faded, and silence settled over them like a heavy weight in the air. "What's going on here?" Jason asked, his tone neutral but firm. One of the twins, the one with curly hair, shrugged with blatant disregard. "We were just swimming. Your pool is awesome, by the way." Jason clenched his jaw. "Yeah, but it's private, and I don't recall giving permission." The kids stammered out rushed excuses and quickly climbed out of the water, grabbing their things before disappearing through the side gate. Jason watched them leave, feeling a tight discomfort settle in his chest. That hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a misunderstanding. It was a warning, and Jason knew with absolute certainty that it wouldn't be the last time. The minutes that followed the incident felt heavy in the air. Jason stood by the pool, hands on his hips, eyes fixed on the water, trying to contain the irritation bubbling inside him. He couldn't understand how anyone could think they could simply trespass on someone else's property like that. Click subscribe and turn on notifications. That way you'll always be up to date with our latest videos and won't miss a thing. This wasn't an innocent mistake. It hadn't been an error. It was a conscious decision. Frowning, Jason made his way to the Marshall's house. The sound of the doorbell echoed inside, and after a few seconds, the door swung open, revealing Chuck with a beer in his hand and his unmistakable confident smile. "Hey, man, what's up?" Jason crossed his arms over his chest. "Your kids and their friends were in my pool." Chuck blinked but didn't lose his grin. "Oh yeah, teenagers, you know how they are. They were just having some fun." Jason kept his expression firm, "Having fun on my property, without permission." Chuck let out a short laugh and took a sip of his beer before shrugging. "Don't be so strict, buddy. They're just kids. They didn't do anything wrong." Jason felt a sharp sting of irritation. That carefree attitude, as if his boundaries didn't matter, was exactly what he had feared when he first met them. Let "Me be clear, Chuck," he said, his tone dry. "I don't want anyone using my pool without permission. I don't want to find strangers in my backyard. I expect you to talk to them and make sure it doesn't happen again." Chuck smiled, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of defiance, that Jason didn't miss. Sure, I'll talk to them. Don't worry about it." Jason didn't reply. He simply nodded and turned back toward his house, feeling Chuck's gaze on his back until he shut the door behind him. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And he was right. The following days passed with a tense calm. Jason tried to convince himself that his conversation with Chuck had been enough. Every night he sat in his backyard, enjoying the reflection of the lights on the water, trying to reclaim the sense of peace he had worked so hard for. But every time he did, he couldn't help but glance at the fence separating his property from the Marshalls, and then the problem returned. It was a Friday afternoon when Jason came home after an exhausting week. The moment he shut the door, he heard voices and laughter. He tensed. Walking with firm steps toward the window overlooking the backyard, he felt his blood boil. The twins were there again, not alone. This time they had brought more friends. Backpacks, snacks, and soda bottles were scattered along the poolside, as if they had turned his home into a public park. Jason felt his patience snap. He stormed outside, crossing the yard until he stood at the edge of the pool. The group noticed him almost immediately. "Hey, Jason," one of the kids greeted with a smile as if nothing was wrong. Jason didn't respond. His dark, serious gaze was enough to make the laughter start to fade. "I told you not to come into my property again." His voice was low, controlled, but carried a sharpness that cut through the air. "Out now!" The kids scrambled, hastily grabbing their things. One of the twins tried to mumble an excuse, but Jason silenced him with a single look. He waited until they had all left through the side gate before locking it and standing there, breathing deeply, trying to calm the anger roiling inside him. It was official. Talking to Chuck had been useless, which meant he had to handle this differently. That night, Jason wrote a note. He didn't bother being overly polite, but he was direct. "This is a reminder that my property is private. I don't want anyone using my pool without my permission. I will no longer tolerate trespassing. I expect you to respect my space." The next morning, he slipped it into the Marshal's mailbox and went back inside his house. For a few days, it seemed like the message had been received. The pool remained empty. Jason started to relax, feeling like maybe, finally, he had managed to set his boundaries. But the truce didn't last long. The following Saturday, after running errands in the morning, Jason returned home with grocery bags in his hands and heard the unmistakable sound of loud music and laughter coming from his backyard. He froze at his front door, feeling disbelief morph into fury. They hadn't just come back. This time, they had brought an entire crowd. He yanked open the patio door, and what he saw left him speechless. Chuck and Melissa were there, along with at least a dozen people. They had brought a portable grill, beers, and snacks. Teenagers splashed in the pool while the adults drank and laughed, comfortably settled in, as if they were in their own home. Chuck, holding a beer can in his hand, flashed him a grin as if nothing were wrong. "Jason, you got here just in time for the party." A chill of anger crept up Jason's spine. He took a step forward, eyes locked on Chuck. "Get out." "Now!" Silence fell over the patio. A few people exchanged awkward glances, but Chuck just kept smiling as if the situation amused him. "Come on, man. No need to overreact. We're just having a good time." Jason clenched his teeth. "There's nothing to discuss, Chuck. You're in my house without my permission. Leave." His tone left no room for argument. Chuck held his gaze for a long second before raising his hands in mock surrender. All right, he said with a dry chuckle. "No need to be so serious." One by one, the guests began gathering their things and leaving. It took nearly 20 minutes before the patio was empty. When Jason was finally alone, he looked around. Empty bottles, leftover food, damp towels tossed over the chairs. The anger he felt was no longer just anger. It was a cold determination. The marshals had crossed the line too many times, and now Jason was going to do something about it. That night, Jason stayed up later than usual. He sat at his dining table with a notebook in hand, jotting down possibilities. He had tried being reasonable. He had spoken. He had warned them. But none of it had worked. Chuck and his family didn't take him seriously. That had to change. Jason had never been a confrontational person. He didn't look for trouble. But there was a very clear line he wasn't willing to let anyone cross. And now they hadn't just crossed the line. They had erased it completely. He didn't want to involve the police. He knew exactly how that could end. A black man calling the authorities in a predominantly white neighborhood over a property dispute. No, he wasn't going to give the marshals the chance to play the victims, to twist the story and turn him into the problematic neighbor. So what could he do? He turned the idea over in his mind for hours until suddenly the solution appeared before him like a revelation. The pool. If the marshals wanted to claim it as their own, he would make sure they never wanted to come near it again. The next morning, Jason drove to a pool supply store on the outskirts of town. He bought exactly what he needed: a large container of granular chlorine, a foaming agent used for themed parties, and a testing kit to ensure he could reverse the effects later. That night, with meticulous precision, he followed the calculations he had worked out during the day. He poured the chlorine into the pool in a concentration high enough to turn the water cloudy and give off a strong chemical smell, enough to make anyone think twice before diving in. Then he added the foaming agent, watching with satisfaction as a thick layer of white bubbles spread rapidly across the surface. By dawn, his pool no longer looked like a shimmering oasis. It looked like a toxic disaster. Perfect. The following Saturday, Jason didn't have to wait long. Just past 1 in the afternoon, as he was reading in his living room, he heard the unmistakable sound of the side gate opening. Jason didn't get up right away. He let a few seconds pass, allowing himself to enjoy the calm before the storm. And then the first scream. What the hell happened to the pool? Jason smirked to himself. He set down his glass of water, stood up, and walked toward the patio door. When he stepped outside, he found exactly the scene he had anticipated. The Marshall twins and a group of teenagers stood at the edge of the pool, staring at it as if they had just found a corpse floating in the water. The water foamed with a thick layer of white bubbles, and the overpowering scent of chlorine filled the air. Want more content like this? Then hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because there's always something new here, and you won't want to miss out. Jason crossed his arms and looked at them in silence. Something wrong? He asked, feigning innocence. One of the twins, Ethan, gaped at him. What? What did you do? Jason tilted his head. Pool maintenance. It's closed for now. The teenagers exchanged uncertain glances. A few stepped back, catching whiffs of the strong chemical scent emanating from the water. Is it safe? One of them murmured. Jason gave a cold smile. I wouldn't get in if I were you. That was enough. Within seconds, the kids started backing away, murmuring to each other with uneasy expressions. The twins lingered a little longer, staring at the pool in frustration, before finally turning and leaving as well. When the side gate closed behind them, Jason let out a silent chuckle. The marshals could play dirty, but so could he. However, Jason knew this wasn't the end. Not with Chuck. And sure enough, not even 24 hours had passed before his neighbor appeared at his door. The knock on the wood was loud and firm. Jason had been expecting it. He opened the door and found Chuck standing at the threshold, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You want to tell me what the hell you did?" Jason rested one hand on the doorframe and looked at him calmly. "Pool maintenance. Is there a problem?" Chuck let out an incredulous laugh. "Maintenance? Your pool looks like a chemical waste dump. What are you trying to do, poison the kids?" "It's not toxic," Jason replied without a hint of emotion. "It's just not in swimming condition, and you, of all people, should know that's not your problem." Chuck's eyes flickered with a mix of frustration and realization. "You know, the whole neighborhood thinks you're an asshole for this." Jason smiled indifferently. "I didn't move here to make friends, Chuck. I moved here for peace. Something you and your family haven't respected." Chuck held his gaze for a long moment. Then he let out a sharp exhale and ran a hand through his hair. "Fine, I get the message." "I hope you do," Jason replied smoothly, "because next time it won't just be foam and chlorine." The man studied him carefully, weighing the threat. Finally, without another word, he turned on his heels and walked away. Jason closed the door and let out a slow breath. He knew he couldn't let his guard down just yet, but for the first time. Since moving in, he felt like he was in control of his own home, and that was something he wasn't willing to lose again. The next few days were surprisingly peaceful. The marshals kept their distance. Chuck no longer greeted him with his usual smug confidence. Melissa avoided eye contact when she passed by. The twins didn't go near the fence, and most importantly, the pool remained empty. Jason enjoyed the newfound tranquility. He allowed himself to settle back into his routine. Afternoons in the backyard, late-night swims in water, finally restored to its original pristine state. But the most surprising part was that the other neighbors seemed to have changed their perception of him. One day the Watsons greeted him more warmly than usual. The young couple with the baby even stopped to chat. And though they never mentioned it outright, Jason could see in their expressions what they were really thinking. Maybe, just maybe, some of them had been waiting for someone to stand up to the marshals. And Jason had done it. Without realizing it, he had gained more than just his peace. He had earned their respect. The days following his confrontation with Chuck were marked by an unusual silence in the neighborhood. Jason, so used to the constant noise from the marshal's house, the twins' laughter, the loud backyard conversations, the sound of the grill lighting up on weekends, began to notice a drastic change. For the first time since he had moved in, his home truly felt like a sanctuary. He found himself relishing the stillness of his evenings, the gentle ripple of water as he swam after work, the golden light of sunset reflecting off the flawless surface of the pool. But at the same time, a part of him remained on alert. He knew the marshals weren't the kind of people to accept defeat easily. He knew this wasn't just about a pool, it was about pride. The first sign that something was shifting came on a Saturday morning. Jason was in his backyard, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone, when he noticed movement at the marshal's house. Nothing extraordinary, just Melissa and the twins taking out trash bags and tidying up the yard. But the unusual part was that, when she saw him, Melissa raised a hand in a quick, casual wave, not exaggerated or enthusiastic, just a brief, almost automatic gesture. Jason observed her curiously, but instead of ignoring it, did something he hadn't done in months. He waved back. Over the next week, small changes began to unfold. For the first time, the twins greeted him as they passed by, though with a shyness that almost made them seem like regular teenagers. Jason, who had spent weeks seeing them as invaders, started to see them for what they really were, kids who had never had someone tell them no. Then on Tuesday afternoon, as Jason was watering the plants in his front yard, Melissa approached him. "Hey, Jason," Melissa said with a reserved smile. Jason straightened up and returned the greeting with a nod. "Melissa." She crossed her arms, looking uncomfortable, as if unsure how to start the conversation. "Listen, "I know we didn't start off on the right foot," she said, lowering her gaze briefly. "And I know my husband isn't the easiest person to deal with." Jason waited. "I just wanted to say that, well, that we get it," she continued. "We understand why you reacted the way you did, and things will change." Jason studied her expression, searching for signs of deception, for a ploy to make him let his guard down. But all he saw was sincerity. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, after a few seconds. Melissa smiled with relief before saying goodbye and heading back to her house. The real change, however, came the following Sunday. Jason was enjoying the peace of the afternoon when he heard the doorbell ring. When he opened it, he found Chuck standing on his porch, holding a six-pack of beer and wearing a slightly awkward expression. "Hey, man," he said, his usual cockiness absent from his tone. "Got a minute?" Jason studied him for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. Chuck walked over to the dining table and set the beer down on the surface. "Look," he began, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm not the kind of guy who apologizes, but I think it's only fair this time." Jason crossed his arms and waited. Chuck sighed. "I was an asshole. I didn't respect your space, and I took it too far." Jason leaned against the table, nodding slightly. "Yeah, you did." Chuck let out a dry laugh. "Well, at least you're honest." There was a silence between them, one that for the first time wasn't filled with tension. "I don't expect us to be friends or anything," Chuck said after a moment, "but I think we can live in the same neighborhood without wanting to kill each other, don't you?" Jason glanced at the beer, then at Chuck. Finally, he picked one up, cracked it open, and took a sip. "We can try." Chuck grinned, grabbed one for himself, and for the first time in months they sat down to talk, not as friends, but as two people who, while never close, could at least coexist in peace. The shift in Jason's relationship with the Marshalls wasn't immediate, but it was real. The twins never trespassed into his yard again. Melissa began greeting him naturally whenever they crossed paths, and Chuck, though still loud and dominant, kept his promise to respect Jason's boundaries. The most surprising thing, however, was the effect it had on the rest of the neighborhood. The Watsons invited him to dinner on a Friday night, something they had never done before. The young couple with the baby started chatting with him more when they saw him in the yard, and even other neighbors, the ones who had never taken sides in the conflict, seemed to look at him differently. Maybe, after all, some of them had been tired of the Marshalls' dominance too. Summer faded into increasingly cooler temperatures, and Jason began to realize that his relationship with the community was no longer that of a solitary outsider. One Saturday afternoon, while raking leaves in his yard, he found a note on his door. It was an invitation. "Neighborhood barbecue. Sunday at the Marshalls' house. Stop by any time." Jason held the note in his hands, surprised. For several minutes he stood there, torn between his old instinct to keep to himself and the possibility of, for the first time in years, actually being part of something. The next day, as the sun began to set and the lights flickered on at the Marshalls' house, Jason crossed the street with a bottle of wine in hand and stepped inside. And for the first time since moving into the neighborhood, he truly felt at home. If this story inspired you, leave a like to support the channel and subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapters. And let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from every corner of the world our channel reaches.